talking about leading through complexity and uncertainty. But actually, to make it more interesting, I think it's going to be good to hear from you. So rather than me speak, I'm going to ask probably 10 or 12 of you to come up and just do a 1-minute presentation on your view of complexity and uncertainty. No, I would love you to do that. And then what we'll do is we'll listen and we'll try and make sense of that as we do it. The other thing, by the way, that's just going to help so that we can really focus everyone's attention, if I could click your mobile phones in, it would just be useful, if you wouldn't mind, and then I'll give them back at the end. It's just that then we can really focus on what the presenters are saying, if you wouldn't mind doing that. Of course, I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to ask you to present. But I wanted you to experience some uncertainty. So what I'd like you to do, if you would, just on your tables, just debrief a bit for a minute or two the gut reaction you had when you thought you might be standing up on stage presenting for a minute. Just for a couple of minutes, debrief what was going through your mind.
Being thrown into things, thinking on our feet now.
You knew I wasn't serious from the start,
well,
so...
no, I didn't know, I just didn't think.
You thought he can't be serious. Okay. What did you say? Horror. Horror, yeah. Sense of horror.
Enthusiasm. We were all up for it.
Enthusiasm, bring it on. Come on, let's do it.
And resentment to handing our phones in.
Yes.
Two contrasting...
So we react in different ways, and how you reacted, that first instinct when you thought you might need to come and stand up, that probably tells you an awful lot about how you react to uncertainty and how you deal with uncertainty. It will give you some real clues if you just go with that instantaneous reaction. One of the key things about what happened was I broke the permission rule. I didn't ask your permission for you to come up and speak. And it was quite uncertain for me because I coach a lot, and one of the sort of things I think about with coaching is how do I make this safe for the person that I'm coaching? And of course, what I did with you there just now was very unsafe, and so I didn't know how you were going to react to that. It's that uncertainty. And I didn't have your permission to get you to come up and speak. And of course, that offends us quite a deep level when someone does something that cuts across whether we've given them permission to do it or not. And the problem with uncertainty and complexity is it happens to us without our permission. That actually we have to experience all of this complexity and uncertainty, but we don't choose to. And I sort of feel that leaders these days are living in a world where they're in charge but not really in control. That perhaps the old model of cause and effect has kind of disappeared. If I do this, I'll get this reaction. So we're in charge, but we're not really in control. And so we feel uncertain. And as human beings, we're kind of pre-programmed to work out how am I going to reduce that uncertainty? What am I going to do to get rid of it? We try really hard to get rid of it. I don't know, who's a parent here? Yeah, a lot of us. And I've started parenting quite late. I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And it still amazes me that when our first child arrived, we left the hospital without the user manual. They just said, off you go and get on with it, you know. And raising children is a complex problem. There's no right answer. In fact, we all do our best and then kind of pray for forgiveness somewhere along the way, I think. But the thing is that leadership's very similar. There's no right answer. And this is really what I want to talk about today, that there isn't a right answer to leadership, that somehow we come to it and we do our best. If there was a right answer, if it was a kind of problem that we could reduce into some kind of linear progression, there would be the one book on leadership. We would all have read it and we would all be doing it perfectly. But actually there are thousands of books on leadership because there isn't a right answer. So what can we do? Well, what we can do, I think, is perhaps change the way we think about leadership. We can perhaps even change what we believe to be true about leadership. And maybe even we can change what we think about our own leadership, what we believe to be possible in terms of our own leadership. Those changes are possible for us, I think, and that's what I'd like to talk about. So we're going to talk about it through 5 different lenses, very briefly. The complexity lens, the systemic lens, what I call the vertical lens, the organisational health lens, and the emotional capital lens. Hopefully all will become clear. What I find in organisations is that there's a huge amount of what I would call the misdiagnosis between a complicated problem and a complex problem. If you're an expert, then you want to reduce everything to something that can be solved by your own intellect. And what we do is we reduce these problems in that way, but of course we sort of like trying to squeeze things into a pressure cooker. They sort of seep out. And unforeseen results happen that we weren't expecting. Somehow staff get disengaged. Sometimes things end up feeling worse than they did before we'd even intervened in the first place, and we don't know why. And Heifetz said this, he's a writer on leadership. The biggest waste of resources by organisations and institutions come from trying to apply purely technical solutions to adaptive problems. And we're really talking in adaptive problems or complex problems about things that have both a social dynamic, a human interaction dynamic, as well as a technical dynamic. Raising children is a good example. Feeding the hungry in the world is a very complex problem. There is no right answer to it. Even something like high-speed rail link 2 you could call is a complex problem because there are so many social dynamics going around, as well as technically how on earth would you build something that would enable you to do what it sets out to do. So there's no right answer with a complex problem. I don't know how that feels for you, the idea that there's a problem that you don't have a right answer to. In one sense, I hope you find that quite liberating. I think a lot of us feel quite guilty that we haven't solved things the way we should have as leaders. We think, I should have fixed that, and I haven't done. But I think it can be very liberating to say, there is no right answer. And so what we do with that complexity is that it brings with it uncertainty. When something's complex and we don't think there's a right answer, we feel uncertain. And as we started today, when we feel uncertain, we feel anxious. And we spend our time as human beings, because we're animals, trying to feel safe. We try to reduce everything so that it feels safer. So what can we do? What can we do with this complexity lens? To me, there's firstly, accept there is no right answer. And that can be quite difficult for a lot of us to do. But the second thing is what I call authentic not knowing. And this is the idea that as a leader, when someone comes to us and says, what should I do about this? We say, I don't know. I don't know, but I'm really interested to find out. What happens when we do that? For a lot of us, in our culture, that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable not to know. A lot of organisations, I don't think cultures are generally what's written on the values board in the reception, almost never. What real cultures are about is the unsaid rules about what happens in the organisation. And usually it's not okay not to know is something in an awful lot of organisations. But you as a leader, if you start saying, actually, in this organisation, it is okay not to know for the leader, you change the whole psychological contract with your staff. For me, if I had £1 for every leader who said to me, I wish my team showed more initiative, I'm not saying I'd be a very wealthy man, but I'd certainly go out and have a nice dinner on it. And the reason is because of the psychological contract that's created. If we are in this place of it's not okay not to know, when people come to us and ask us, we have to tell them. We have to tell them what to do. Why do they show no initiative? Because they're sitting waiting to be told what to do. Because that's the psychological contract we've created. And every time a leader says that to me, I wish my team showed more initiative, I say, so how did you co-create the situation where they don't show initiative? Because somehow you've done it in your psychological contract. On the other hand, if they come to you and you say, I don't know, you have to make joint meaning together. Suddenly they're engaged in the problem. They have to bring all their resources, all their skills, all their ability to solving it. So I'd really encourage authentic not knowing. And thirdly, try developing a new toolkit. There's something different about the skills that are required about leading in complexity. Somehow it's more about collaboration. It's more about inquiry. It's more about listening. It's more about emergence. It's more about experimentation. Steve and I did some work with an organisation a while ago where it was a group of companies, and we did a leadership programme with them. Group chief executive, on the module before Christmas of this programme, we did some stuff around deeper listening. And then we came back after Christmas and we did a debrief, how's everybody? And the chief executive of the group stood up and said, I've had the best Christmas of my life. And we thought, oh, that's interesting, why is that? He said, because I listened to my children for the first time in my life. And so this stuff's important. And it sounds like listening, does it matter? I work with another organisation in the film industry, the leadership team, and there's an awful lot of people who speak a lot in that group. And surprise, surprise, they're not very good at making decisions, because every decision gets made based on advocacy. Who shouts the loudest is the person who gets to make the decision, or the one with the most stripes on their shoulder, or the one who's actually prepared to keep talking when everyone else has fallen asleep. That's the one who will actually get their way in the end. As opposed to the idea of inquiry. Oh, that's your idea. That's really interesting. How can I build on that? How can I build on that? How can I build on that? So the very way that we make decisions in organisations needs to change if we're really going to think about it from that lens. The second lens which I'd like to share with you is the systemic lens, and we've already kind of alluded to this. There's a company I work with in Australia, and they said to me, we've got to get rid of Emma. Emma's a problem, she's the cancer in the organisation, we need to cut it out. So we talked about it, and I said, that's very interesting. Wasn't there another cancer last year that you had to cut out? Oh yeah, Melissa, yeah, she had to go. Oh, okay. So I said, so who's going to be the cancer next year? I'm just wondering. Because very quickly it became obvious something else was at play in this organisation. There was something systemic that was going on. A new boss joins an organisation and they start and they say, everything's gone wrong up to now, but I'm going to solve it, don't worry. They don't usually succeed in my experience. Somehow the organisational system has a way of taking them in and spitting them out again. Or a key member of staff leaves, and leaves badly. They're pushed out of the organisation, but it's not done well. They're not recognised for their contribution, and suddenly they're gone. Somehow the organisation is entangled still with that lever and gets pulled towards them. I worked with one client where they had a pretty charismatic leader who'd formed the organisation, worked with them in this sector, but he was a bully and he had to leave. But actually everybody focused on the bully side of him after he'd gone, and actually what he'd done to get this organisation to where it wasn't recognised. Now somehow he's still, even 5 years later, entangled with that organisation because something didn't happen. And so what emerges is that we have this interconnected nature of everything. We kind of know it instinctively, but changing something in one part of the system has implications elsewhere in the system. It's the idea really that we're interested in the bowl and the water, not just the goldfish. And if you think of it in terms of a magnet and the iron filings, that there's a magnetic field there. We can't see it, but we know it's operating. And it's the idea of the systemic lens. And lots of work has been done around this. But there are three principles that happen in organisational systems. And time is the first principle. That somehow those that were there first need to be honoured in some way. So a new boss arriving in an organisation saying, I'm here, it looks like an awful lot needs to happen. I would firstly like to recognise that I would not be here, I would not have this opportunity if it wasn't for those that have gone before me creating that opportunity for me. I would really appreciate learning from the wisdom of those who were here first. Please tell me how things work in this organisation. And then I hope together we can go on a new journey of change, because it feels to me that that's what this organisation needs. That boss can succeed because somehow the organisational system is being honoured through the principle of time. There's a second principle in organisational systems, the principle of place. And I worked with an American client recently, and we did an exercise around this. We're going to do a very similar exercise in a minute. And I asked the president of the company, I said, we were at dinner the night before, and I said, what does Joy do, this member of staff? And he explained, and I still didn't really get it. I didn't really understand what she did. The next day we did this exercise, and she was brave enough halfway through it to say, do you know what? I don't know my place in this organisation. I don't know where I fit. And what happens in organisations is the more complex we make them, from matrix structures, from reorganisations, from changing roles and responsibilities, from making people redundant and other people taking on different things, from transition, is that people lose their sense of place. And if people don't know their sense of place, the organisation becomes unhealthy. And the third principle is the idea of exchange, that somehow, in whatever way we measure it, there needs to be exchange. Now, an obvious way is that we give our time in exchange for a salary. That's an exchange. But there might be other things. There might be other things you get by way of exchange. You might get your professional development. You might get a sense of self-actualization, a real sense of satisfaction. It might build your confidence. There's all sorts of ways that you might feel you're getting things from the organisation. You might give in other ways. You might feel you're giving much more emotionally than just your time. You might be mentoring other people in the organisation. There might be lots more that you give by way of exchange. But when that sense of exchange, again, is out of kilter, then again we struggle, and the organisational system somehow becomes unhealthy. One of the key principles of the systemic lens is acknowledging what is. That might sound quite strange, but I think we're fixated in our organisations about where we're moving to. We spend an awful lot of time on visioning exercises and strategy and plans, and they're all about being somewhere else. and not much time is spent on acknowledging what is. I work with the Director General, I coach of an industry body in a different industry from yours. And just as we were talking, we'd been spending a lot of time on what she was going to do, the plans for the organisation, how it's going to have a bigger impact and so on. And I said to her, it just feels to me like you feel powerless. And you know, she was pretty emotional, and she went, you're right, I feel completely powerless. Now, there was no point talking about plans, visions, anything else, until we dealt with why does she feel ignored by these particular stakeholders, the powerlessness that she experienced. And actually the very acknowledging of what is for her began the journey that we could actually move to a much more productive place for her and for her whole organisation. But if we don't acknowledge what is, then something gets left unsaid. There's an organisation that we're doing some work with who have recently been through a redundancy process. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the pain of that. And now they want to do a culture exercise of moving things to a much more positive culture. Now the point is, actually, it won't work unless somehow the principle of time and what's gone before, what is acknowledged. You can't possibly suddenly develop a fantastically positive culture if you don't acknowledge the pain of what's just happened in the organisation. You can write it up on the wall, these are our new values, but it won't make any difference. The third one I'm going to look at is the vertical lens. One of the people who developed this thinking is a guy called Keegan, and he tells a tale of two brothers at the top of the Empire State Building. And the 3-year-old says, look at all those ants down there. And the 7-year-old says, look at all those people. They look just like ants. Two brothers, one's 7, one 3, but one has a different way of reasoning with the world. My 3-year-old has just recently worked out that when we have a chair and some kind of roll or something, wrapping paper or whatever, that it's actually not a space rocket, it's just representing a space rocket. He says, it's not a real space rocket, Daddy, is it? And he's only just worked out that a few months ago it was a space rocket. So what happens is that we gradually change the way that we reason about the world. Maybe in a sales environment, we've got a new client, someone's really excited, well done. Someone else says, yeah, it's really good. And it's symbolic of when we work really closely as a team, good things happen. So there's just these levels of thinking. Now, as children, we're quite happy to develop through these levels of thinking, to start thinking about things in a more complex and a more reasoned and a more sort of sense-making way. But as adults, we tend to stop that process. And actually, most of the systems that we introduce within organisations around competency frameworks and 360-degree feedback and appraisals and so on, just reinforce this, that somehow we reinforce this horizontal learning. And it's all good, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's all learning at the same level of thinking. And it happens in pretty much every organisation that I come across. And perhaps a metaphor, a way of thinking it is the idea of filling the glass with water is horizontal learning, whereas actually expanding the size of the glass is vertical learning. Or think of it as another way. If you've got a computer, horizontal learning is adding more software. Go out and buy this piece of software, and I'll get that piece of software, and we're adding it. But we're just increasing our knowledge, really, by doing that. But a time comes when you think, see, I need a new computer. I need one that's got faster processor. No one's got a bigger memory. That's vertical development. But I would say, in my experience, that virtually no expenditure is made in organisations on vertical leadership development. All the expenditure in organisations goes into horizontal leadership development. Fourth lens, more briefly, the organisational health lens. We have two things, don't we, going on in organisations. We have the strategy, we have the planning, we have the technology, the operations, all of the things that sort of make up what we do. And this is the stuff you learn about in business school. This is the stuff you learn about through all of your work. But of course, it's only half the story. Actually, the health of the organisation is the other half of the story. And the interesting thing is that I believe that the organisational health stuff actually, in a way, trumps the stuff on the other side. But it's messier, it's tougher. So most of us think, oh, well, it's a bit messy over there. So although I've spent 90% of my time over on the left-hand side, it's so messy over here, I'll go back and carry on there again, try and tweak that a bit more, tweak the strategy a bit more, work a bit more on the 5-year plan, whatever it is. But we know really we're digging in the wrong place. When I take my son to the beach, we bury treasure under the sand, and it would be a bit like him knowing where I buried the treasure, but him going and digging somewhere else because the sand's softer. You know, it doesn't make any sense, but it's what we do. It's what we do because all our attention is on the smart side of the equation because it's easier. But you talk to most leaders in organisations, and I'm sure you realise yourself, actually, if you could get rid of the politics, the minimal politics, have little confusion, if people knew their role, knew their place, if you had high morale, if you had high productivity, if you had low staff turnover, that's what would really make the difference in your organisation. But somehow, we don't do it. As I said earlier, culture's not what's written on the wall. I work with one client, a major bank in the city, and they've just launched their new values. And you probably would believe the level of scepticism there is from the staff in the organisation. Because the truth is that values are discovered in an organisation. It's what really goes on. They're the values. It's not what you suddenly in a meeting think, oh, what should we make up today? We'll stick it up on the wall. It's not how it works. And so the organisational health has to come from the real engagement about what's really going on in organisations. And in that organisation, one of the key things is don't admit you don't know. You know, you have to know. And never admit that you don't know, because that would show weakness. That's the true culture of that organisation. So how do we get a healthy organisation? Well, to me, the first step is a cohesive leadership team. That I always say an inch at the top is a chasm further down the organisation. People are so interested in what the exec team think, and particularly they're really interested in when they disagree with each other, and they really want you to come and slag each other off when you come out of the boardroom. They love all of that, people in the organisation, and it creates these vast splits. So I'd really say work on that trust between you. What else is important? I think a clear sense of purpose for the organisation. I often say that the really inspired organisations don't just know what they do and how they do it, they know why they do it. And there aren't that many organisations that do know why. Actually, for a lot of you, your purpose is probably quite clear to you why you're doing what you do. But I'd suggest to you that in a lot of housing associations, that sense of purpose has somehow got lost. It's become fractured away from you. And the other thing I talk about is dealing with the blockages. In pretty much every coaching piece of work I do and every team I work with, there are some missing conversations. And I really ask you, what are the missing conversations in your organisation? Well, with one chief executive, the missing conversation for him is he's been running his organisation for 20 years, and he's got some personal stuff that he really wants to do alongside his commitment to the organisation. But he doesn't know how to have the conversation with the chairman, and the danger is he's going to retire in 5 years' time a bitter man because he hasn't actually done some of the other stuff he wanted to do in his life, all because there's a missing conversation. Or somebody with his boss who I coach, who really doesn't know where he stands. He doesn't know where he stands, and actually the boss has made it quite clear, I don't have confidence in you. The missing conversation, and he was brave enough to have it the other week, was, what would I need to do for you to have confidence in me? Suddenly, this boss, who can be a bully, changed and said, that's a great question, and I'm really prepared to invest in you to find out. Because he was brave enough to have the missing conversation. At the most obvious level, but you'd be amazed how often it happens, I got a call from a client and she said to me, she's an MD of a business, and she said, I've got to sack my PA. I said, why is that? She said, because she's useless. So I said, does your PA know that she's useless? And she said, no. I said, really? So you've never told her that you're unhappy with her performance? No. I said, so is that fair that you're going to now sack her when you've never even told her that you have any concerns about her performance? But you'll be amazed how often it happens that somehow we just don't have the conversations that need to happen because somehow it's easier not to. Right, just one final lens in the last couple of minutes. The emotional capital lens. So I'm no neuroscientist, but there's some really interesting research that says there's very little correlation between IQ and leadership success. That actually over decades, no one's really been able to prove any correlation between the two. Now, my suggestion is you need a level of IQ to be in the game. You need to be bright enough. But beyond that, actually, there's a much greater correlation between emotional intelligence and leadership success. Why is that? It just seems that somehow what people respond to, one of our roles as leaders is to inspire. How do we inspire? Well, it's through these emotional competencies. So I used to was commercial director of this organisation for a long while, and I had a member of staff called Sam, and I hadn't seen her for a couple of years. I'd left the organisation. I was still in the same group, but I'd left the organisation, and I saw her, and I said, "How are you?" And she said, "Oh, I'm fine." She said, "It's not as good working there as it was when you were there." And immediately my ego was like, "Ah, lovely." And I sort of thought, oh, because I'm a great strategist, or because I was responsible for that phenomenal sales growth, or, you know, inspirational leader, or whatever. But before I sort of assumed any of that, I said, "Why? Why is it not as good as it was when I was there?" And she said, "Because when my mum died, you came and sat on the edge of my desk and asked me how I was." That was it. 30 seconds. And that person would have run through a brick wall for me, just because I took 30 seconds to care. So what can we do? What would be my conclusions for you? Well, I suppose 4 very quick things. Firstly, grind a new set of lenses. So think about each of the challenges you have through these 5 lenses. Secondly, accept that we don't know the answer to everything, and that not knowing is fine. It's good to not know, because it engages other people, it brings them into it. And then be curious and collaborative and inquisitive. Just really want to know. And I suppose linked to that would be the 4th thing, and I just love this, and I'll close with this quote. "In times of change, learners will inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." So I just really encourage you in your leadership to keep learning, to want to know more.